Welcome to the Revenue Room podcast, where we explore strategies and insights from CEOs and revenue-critical C-suite executives who are leading businesses in the information and data economy. Our guest today has built a business around solving this exact problem. Janice Liu is the founder and CEO of Mantis, a boutique consultancy that discovers new revenue streams in existing data assets. Janice brings a unique perspective to data monetization. This is her sixth startup venture, with her entrepreneurial journey beginning at the age of 10 when she generated $20,000 selling imported collectibles. Today, she leads Mantis in helping companies appraise their data assets, prioritize product development opportunities, and broker deals directly with LLMs and SLMs. Beyond Mantis, Janice co-founded the supperclub.ca, a leadership network, and Filling the Gap, a nonprofit supporting the Barbara Schliffler Commemorative Clinic. She serves on multiple boards and actively invests in and advises startups globally. I met Janice actually at the FIP conference in Madrid this fall. And when she told me what she did and what her business focuses on, I was super excited because this whole construct of valuating data as a strategic asset that could improve company valuation, improve how investors look at your business and customers is absolutely so needed. And it's revolutionary in my book because I don't really know if anyone else is doing it. But Janice, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Heather. Thanks for having me.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I really loved, we always ask our guests to tell us an exciting, interesting part of their career journey. And I loved your story about your business when you were 10 years old, which you will have to tell us about. But what I'd really like you to dive into is how your experience has led you to launch Mantis and maybe touch upon your collectibles business. But
yeah,
it's really interesting for us to hear.
Thank you. I will. I mean, I think I was talking to one of my co-founders last night about this, funny enough, because she was saying, did you always think you were going to be an entrepreneur? And the answer is no. My father was or is, but I never consciously thought that was going to be a thing. So when I was 10, we used to go back to Beijing for the holidays summer holidays, because my parents are Chinese. And one summer, that specific summer, when we went, you always get as a child or any passenger, you get 2 check bags. And so for some reason, I decided to not fill one of my check bags with all the stuff that I usually would get. DVDs, CDs, like everything from the 90s that you would want that you can't get quickly or in mass volume in North America. And I was just walking through a market one day and I stumbled upon these Thai Beanie Babies. And I asked the people that were selling them, are these real? Like, where are you getting them from? How is this possible? Because there were some super rare ones in their inventory that they were showing. And they pretty much said, this is directly from the Thai Beanie Baby factory. We always keep some to ourselves or whatever they want to do to sell off. And I was like, it's a little sketchy, but I'm going to take a risk. So I looked up the factory. I had my little Thai Beanie Baby book with me so I could validate if the product looked exactly like what it was in the collectible guidebook. And I brought back essentially a suitcase of Thai Beanie Babies. My mother thought I was crazy, as you can imagine. And it's also pretty interesting because I had to last the whole summer with that decision, right? When you're 10, it's like a lot of conviction. So when we got back to Vancouver, I asked her to go put a classifieds ads up in the North Shore News. And so she just did. She said, we have some collectible Beanie Babies and we are looking to sell them. And people just started coming to our living room. I merchandised our Thai Beanie Babies. And that's how I sold everything in 2 weeks.
Wow. Your mom was probably like, woohoo.
My mom was like, what is happening here? But I think, I mean, you're an entrepreneur, you know this. Like, it's sometimes not always about, when you're at that age particularly, it's not about the model you're trying to create. It was more so about the fact that I didn't realize that this could be so fun, right? I felt like I found a gap. And then that's transcended itself into several ventures in my adult life. But your other question about like how I got here was I started my career in advertising. So I worked for all of the not all of them, but many of the large holding companies. For those who don't know, there's like about 7 of them, similar to consulting, that are huge and they dominate the market. And so I worked for 2 or 3 of them, and I worked at the time. It was, if you think about it, the mid 2010s, the beginning of Google's dominance, the beginning of Meta playing a big role on the internet. And so the change in the pace of it was so fast. I learned everything about how does inventory move on the internet? How does an impression mean essentially a data point? And then essentially over a span of 10 years, I got the opportunity to lead a data company for one of the holdcos for North America. And the advertising use case was the use case we focused on. So we built essentially an audience platform that allowed you to transact and target these audiences across all digital platforms, and you would take a margin. So no different than, to be honest, how Google or Facebook make money.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went from that world into scaling that business for 4 years, and then deciding that I'm going to leave because I think data is in every company and it's the new oil essentially, but I want to do more with it beyond just my use case. And then Mantis was born 3 years ago this November. So we have a little toddler of a company, we call it.
Yes, you're bringing up a child.
I'm bringing up a child. She thinks she's 6, but she's actually 3.
Yes. We need to make sure she doesn't start adulting too fast.
That's right.
So let's talk about how you help your customers with your appraisal methodology. And let's dive into what the appraisal part means, as it relates to the way you qualify data assets.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, because of my experience in the data space and essentially buying data for the platform I used to support, as well as buying and selling data on behalf of certain customers in the past few years, we know how much data is worth and how much it's transacted in the marketplace when it's a flat file, when it's a product that's finished, etc. But the challenge is, how do you know how to look at the totality of what you have and what it's worth as an asset form? So we came up with this methodology last fall because there was many publishers in the world that were looking to assess how much their data is worth to either sign a deal with the LLMs or litigate against them. And so we wrote the report, essentially this assessment, for about 24 of them globally. And the way we do it is pretty common sense. It's lateral thinking. You take essentially a sense of what the data is. There's really only 3 types of data in a company. It's either personally identifiable customers, it's either operations, logistics, interactions with your customer perhaps, or customer service. And then the third category is content. So against those 3 kind of raw resource levels, you look at what kind of products currently exist today and what are the traits that exist in them, and can your data set you're assessing build those products? Mm-hmm. And so it forces you, if you're in CPG, to think about finance. If it forces you in travel to think about retail, right? So then we take a look at how much money and revenue those products are generating at a global level or a certain market level. And then we take that addressable market and we essentially math it back. So then what happens is, if you're using our appraisals for litigation or in court, it's completely defensible. If you're using it for M&A, it's also very defensible. If you're using it for broad business strategy, again, it becomes a product roadmap for you on what you're trying to build and essentially the data strategy for your company. So we look at it, and I was talking to someone about this earlier this week as well, is that, there's chief data officers across many enterprises and organizations, but their sole purpose or function usually is to protect it. How do I protect it? How do I make sure that it's not a risk for the company? The way we think about it is, how much revenue can it generate? So it's just flipping the concept and thinking about it almost as a profit center versus a cost center.
Okay, so just to unpack a little bit of that. So one is, I liked how you framed, you've got there are 3 data set, three categories of data. One is your customer data, how you're interacting with them, to, through the pipeline to closed won, to then how are they consuming what you've promised them. And in a media business or an events business, that's multi-sided because you've got your audience and you've got your advertisers / exhibitors, let's say, but in other markets, it could be different types of ecosystems of customers. So it's actually a huge amount of data sitting there. It's then your customer, your operations data, which is kind of connecting into that. I might be messing this up a little bit.
You got it.
And that's actually like finance. It could be like with the customer,
Supply
payments,
chain.
supply chain.
You got it.
And then you have content. How is the content being consumed?
Yes. And how is it being written? Do you own the content? Do you license it?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Because the content previously to the rise of Gen AI, you really only had consideration for the operations data sets and the customer set. So most people think about it from a perspective of how many customers do I have? How much data do I have? But we have to pop this bubble a lot for folks, which is it's not actually about volume. It's in fact, it's not actually about anything related to what you have. It's more so related to who was want to buy it. It's kind of like selling your house, right? If you think about it, you're like, I'm going to stage my home. I'm going to make it beautiful, all these things. And I'm going to price it a certain amount. Great. But the problem is you're not going to be able to dictate who's buying it. The buyer dictates the market price. So it's less about essentially what you have. It's more about the use case and the application. So, and then to my point earlier, now that we have Gen AI proving its validity, content is now worth something. And everyone's been storing their content in a messy database for the past 20 years because you didn't have to clean it. You didn't need to use it for anything. But now you need it. You need it for training. You need it to train agents. You need it to train other aspects and use cases in your business for automation, for better customer service. And you didn't think you needed it then. So now it is worth something. So when we look at those three pieces of resources, they can be joined together, they can be joined separately, they can build things independently or be essentially combined to build things. And that's what we mean.
And that, I was talking with somebody the other day, Pete Pashal, actually. He is the founder of Media Copilot. He'll be at Revved Up, by the way. And I'd love to introduce you to, but he's very much about the, AI and the impact on content. And one of the, there were some lawsuits that just got settled, or three lawsuits in California, all with different outcomes. But the one thing that struck me about all of this is this idea that content, if it's available out there for purchase, right? I could subscribe to the information, or I could buy a book. That me doing that and consuming that content that way is the same value that an LLM should pay for that. But I disagree with that entirely, because it's one thing for me to read an article to learn myself as an individual. It's another entirely different story if an LLM is repeatedly using the content to drive repeated value that they monetize over and over and over again. So now the content value model has to be completely rethought for that use case.
Correct. So you're hitting the nail on the head, right? So the use case is actually what should determine the usage. I have publishers, like a board member recently who said, Janice, if you think my data's worth so much, how come no one's come and just written me a blank check? And I'm like, that's a great point, but no one wrote, the oil sands and the oil fields blank check before the car was invented. So why would you do that?
Yeah, that's a great point.
The use case hasn't been invented, right?
Yep. And I think there's a lot of struggle around this. But then back to the value you bring to the table, I liked how you framed this. You essentially are making data, a revenue, a revenue center, right? That companies can utilize in three very important areas, which is M&A, litigation, and your broad company strategy, especially as it relates to developing, either improving existing revenue streams by wrapping data solutions around it, or actually creating standalone data products.
You got it. And I think now the conversation, or the messaging we're getting everywhere, is we have to get to AI, right? This past year, every single CEO in the world was saying, how do I get to AI? And there was that MIT report that said 95% of AI projects have failed. Why do you think they fail? They fail not because the models are wrong. They fail not because the people aren't trying. They're failing because your data isn't ready. It's not clean. It's not prepped properly. You don't understand the use case well enough. And we're trying to use too broad of a stroke to solve problems, when we call it actually shadow inefficiencies. My chief innovation officer, Guybrush, calls it that, which is when you look at the application of it, you need to understand the depth of the problem and the amount of inefficiency it is causing, and can AI solve for that? And what is the data required to input into that AI in that specific use case to solve for it? That's just not the framework or the thinking many of us have been exposed to, particularly if you're a CEO, let's say, that got their MBA 20 years ago and never had to, learn how to manage an IT team, manage a digital team, manage a data team, right? So the expectations are really out of control, but you have to start to relearn these things and understand it because of how proliferated it's going to be and how it's going to be industry changing.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. I think what I've seen is that there has been an inordinate amount of time and effort spent on what I call the audience side of data, like for personalization and things along those lines. But what's been ignored is like what you brought up, and I had just started thinking about this, is the whole content side of like all of this, you call it dormant content that has lots of value now. It just was kind of pushed in the back, put it in a box. It's a year old, all that has to be normalized. And then I like to say the revenue room side, like the entire revenue side, like, by the way, and those three things kind of map together.
That's right.
Right.
It's the same three things for every company. So if anyone listens to this and takes that away, just frame it as those are your raw resources as data output. And if you don't want to hire or formalize this, you can essentially just think about what already exists that uses what I have, right? Because you're looking for the car. And what happens is that way you can look at the application and then you can math it back. But again, like I said earlier, I think a lot of chief data officers are thinking about models. They're thinking about risk. They're thinking about how to contain it. They're not thinking about how it's going to generate more money probably than the core business, which is, in all honesty, the case now.
Yeah.
Most of our valuations, we're seeing the data being worth more than your core business because of the way the world's moving, right? And that's pretty significant. So when we were doing this, like I said, last year for publishers, that's one vein of it, which was, a lot of content. But now we're doing it for large enterprise, banks, retailers. And again, I'm just saying it's the data is worth more than your core business. And that's been game changing for essentially a lot of the C-suite.
Mm-hmm. Well, that leads me to a really great segue to my next question is you work with companies like banks, retailers, advertising agencies, not just publishers. What characteristics make a company an ideal candidate for true data monetization? And like what industries do you see sitting on, like you just said, like, do they realize that their data is now worth more than their company, legacy streams?
So I would say, this is actually our company thesis. We believe every company is a data company. If you have any kind of a customer, you're a data company because you probably have a website where there's content. You probably have some sort of fulfillment process, which is operations. And you probably have a customer, which is the customer records, right? So every company is a data company, whether or not you like it or not. Now you can choose how you want to do something with it. Right. So there's two things. One, I think, is people have to understand that you can't just realize your revenue and your value within two weeks, 2 months kind of thing. It does take a little bit of time, but once you kind of get your hand around it, you can probably pay back all your investments within a year or two. That's kind of what we're seeing. Some of the products we've built, we've seen the payback period less than 12 months even. The second thing I would say is, even if you don't want to make money with your data today, or maybe you're a government body and you don't feel comfortable essentially letting citizens know you're using the data for revenue, you need to look at what are the use cases internally and how to use data better internally, because without that, you can't get to AI. And if you can't get to AI, you're not going to compete. You're not going to exist in 10 years. Yeah. So either one of those points need to be your inflection point, but you have to trigger it pretty much now. Otherwise, you're going to be behind.
Well, I think you're being generous there, actually. I think you won't be here in 2 years. I think 10 years is a long runway. The speed at which things are moving right now, it's so incredible. And if you actually think about when we started Revved Up, we came up with the idea in, I want to say it was March 2024, because we were insane and said, oh, let's have the event in September 2024. Thank God we did not do that. We moved it to March, but that's how I remember this date. But when we first started out with our thesis for Revved Up was, the AI didn't even enter in the equation. It was data fueled revenue, profitability, and value creation. And people are like even saying, oh, don't bring AI in. It's such a buzzword right now. And I was like, okay, literally 3 months later, I would say it just totally, about shift. And it was then data and AI, and it has never stopped. And where we didn't know a lot, last February, we know a lot more now. And every day, like the new models, I just read something about Claude coming out with its like superior, coding app model, which I'm not a coder. So, so I think the speed is going so rapidly and quickly, and that these business models, especially again, advertising based one, they're going to get disintermediated if they don't figure out a new plan of attack, so.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so let's just getting back to Mantis and your business without naming confidential details. Could you walk us through a specific client transformation where data became a significant revenue stream, and what was the before and after?
Okay, so I won't name clients, I won't name names confidentially. We were working with a large advertising group that needed to compete in the market, and they needed essentially an audience platform. And the audience platform was super important because if you think about it, the targeting on Facebook, no matter what you put into targeting, is going to be interpreted different than what you put into Amazon. Why? Because the traits are just naturally different. Someone you call high income here, maybe not high income there, just by slight nuances. Mm-hmm. And so we helped them build an audience platform that used a bunch of open source data sets, a bunch of data together, and then we architected a way to do targeting relative to your profile or the profile you want to reach. And then they use this across all their digital platforms now. And so if you're a brand working with this group, they can give you essentially now a centralized audience activation point for the same across every single platform. And that's been a huge differentiator for them. They're now in 7 figures within 2 years. The payback period's already been paid, things like that. But that's an example where before they didn't have something, they knew they needed to compete, and after they have something else.
So that actually could be an interesting, if I look at white space opportunity, like correlating that to, let's say, a large media conglomerate that has properties across different channels, different audience sectors through acquisition, for example, that kind of play could have significant value for them.
Yeah, because if they actually create, let's just pick on like some sort of publisher group. If they create their own version of that, the only way they're thinking about it right now is I need a CDP, I need a clean room, I need all these things. That's just tech debt. If you know technology, you just need to house it in wherever you're housing your main cloud, right? All the clouds have it. You shouldn't be spending more money on doing it. You should spend money on connecting it. Once the data is connected, to your point, now it's so much easier to activate. I want to reach someone who looks like a Heather across 7 of my sites. And now you have a better upside from a revenue perspective because you can position it differently. Mm-hmm. So that's a great example of application.
Yeah. Have you worked with any company where they said, I'd like you to evaluate our data, give us the data valuation to help us improve our company valuation, our multiple?
Yeah, so we're working with a few right now, I won't name names, that are looking to either exit or go through an M&A process in the next 6 to 8 months. And, you'll get your whatever X multiples on certain EBITDA or what type of business you are. But the moment you can put a value on the data, it exponentially gives your multiple probably 5 to 8x higher. Because if you think about it, your services business is probably 4x EBITDA. If you're a tech business, you're probably at an 8 to 10x EBITDA. But if you're a tech business that's also a data business, then you can get it up to probably 15 to 18. And the reason for that is because the investor's thinking about, if you're already thinking about data this way, then your jump to AI will be so easy.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to ask you the investor buy-in, like do they buy this? But it sounds like they do. Because of that, your speed to AI.
Yeah, because if you think about, not all companies right now are that. There's only a handful that are AI first, right? Lovable, for example, everybody knows that you can vibe code prompt and it can give you a website. That's great. But the application of it is still very challenging if you're an enterprise and you need to apply something like the output of that to your stack. So when investors are thinking about companies, they're also looking at how quickly this company can transform into an AI company. Therefore, I can get essentially return on that. So they're going to think about that more with a salient lens if you can demonstrate that you have your data ready, if you can demonstrate your data is already been valued, right? The fact that you have that valuation already signals that you know it's worth something.
That's really critical. I think it's going to become more and more and more important. The media space here in the U.S. is heavily like private equity has a very heavy presence, especially in that, So we've been hearing, and just that the importance of AI capabilities, AI strategy, AI use cases, and proofs of even if it's through pilots is becoming much more part of the due diligence than ever before. Do you work with U.S. companies?
Yeah, we do. We have a few clients in the U.S. already.
Excellent. That's good to know.
We now have clients, I would say, in Europe, the U.S., Canada, and some Asian markets, and we're in touch with the Chinese LLMs too. So it's kind of like we understand if we're seeing the same thing happening in parts of the world. And the good news is that what we're building and what we're doing is really applicable to most markets, which is very cool. And to your point, like I think when we met, even like a lot of people in different spaces are telling me this. I haven't validated this fully, but there's not a lot of data appraisers. There's a lot of data brokers. There's a lot of data platforms, but no one's appraising it. Right? It's kind of like an option. Yeah.
No, I agree 100%. And in fact, it's again, just talking about how fast the market goes. So one of the, I took this course with MIT on data monetization like 3 years ago.
Amazing.
I loved it. It was how it really helped me shape my, the way I think about it, which to your point is regardless of whether you're looking to monetize it externally, you've got to get the internal data monetization going, which is the efficiencies that add cash to the bottom line because you're working smarter, better with your data. But with that said, I became, I connected with the, Barbara Wixom, the professor and the researcher who constructed the course and taught it through the virtual side. And I've had calls with her, but I would say 12 months ago when I was talking about this revved up, I asked her about data valuation. Like,
wow.
And she says it doesn't exist yet. I'm just saying. And I think at that time, like maybe at that time for her, like here, like she says we've been struggling with it. Like we like in terms of really, it's like they're working on it. But so the point is that you actually have a company that's now doing it. This is like you are definitely crossing the chasm. You're ahead of the curve. But this is, I think, an absolute critical must have for any business. Well, you say every business is a data business, which I agree with. But I think that's even more pronounced in information and data intensive businesses. Like media, like events, like, data as a service or information services and marketing services. So your approach includes, you go to help companies and you create a revenue matrix for them to see what's possible, right? With their data in terms of productization and monetization.
That's right.
What's your methodology like in doing that without, again, sharing, trade secrets or anything along those lines? But how do you go about trying to understand what a company should, what is the state of affairs, their data house, and then what should they pursue first?
Yeah. So the first half of the question, so how do we look at what they have? What I can tell you is no matter how advanced and great your company is, you don't have enough documentation. There's no documentation of where everything is because, to your point earlier, it hasn't been really salient or even something that people thought about as much because you just dump your content, let's say, into a Hadoop. But the problem is you need to understand the inventory. And so we see that more pronounced from, I would say, the personally identifiable customer side, but we don't see that nearly as available when it comes to content and the other parts of operations. Even customer service, right? We have customer service logs, but is it meta tagged? Do you have it stored properly? Is there a data flow connector between that system and another system? These are the things we're looking for. And when we're looking at that, we're looking at is the level of the resource readiness. So is the data ready? Is it cleaned? Is it, automatically transmissible to somewhere else? Do I have the highways already created? Because when we're selling to buyers, such as some of the LLMs, for example, they're expecting the data to come in probably in 12 hours. They're expecting a deal to be done in 24. And if you have essentially control of a privacy office or someone that has some sort of governance that's taking this into weeks, that's not the buyer for you. You're not ready for that, right? So these are the kind of conversations we have. And then secondly, to your point about how we look at what it can do is we have essentially a lot of the monitoring, the business analysis across all sectors globally. So there might be things that don't exist in North America and the US, but they exist in Indonesia. And so we're looking at, does this product exist anywhere else? So, I hear a lot of publishers, for example, selling their data to media monitoring. Why are you selling it to them if you can build it yourself? These are the questions we are now having with businesses, right? Because you didn't want to look at it, so you outsource it. Great, you made some money from it, but now do you realize how much money they are making from it? That's the conversation we have, right? And so it's a combination of, are you outsourcing something that now you're hooking yourself onto a revenue source? That's one aspect. And then could you make more money from it if you didn't?
So just to regroup on that, I'll recap. So one is how organized is the data is a key, because you just make a huge point. If you can't give it to them, like you've got no business having even a conversation yet. Like you have to have it.
I equate it to like selling a house. You can't sell a house if your house is a mess. No one's going to walk in and be like, this is a beautiful house, right? They're going to go, this is a mess. The hoarder lives here.
Yeah.
But it's the essence that it has to be clean. It has to be staged. It has to be perfectly presented. That's kind of it.
And then the other second layer is the uniqueness of the data asset itself.
Yep.
And
the uniqueness of it and whether or not it can be meaningful to someone else in a different sector.
Yep.
So, you mentioned earlier where it's like information heavy businesses. We do see them being like, oh my gosh, I need to move into this space. But arguably, like the banks are big buyers, right? The amount of money that Bloomberg buys in data a year is over $1 trillion. Like this market already exists. That's why when you're like, 12 months ago, there wasn't appraisers. So like, that's great. But this data market has been existent since the dawn of digital. Right. So it's not in a sense, how you're like, I've never met an appraiser. I'm like, I don't feel like I'm really pioneering. I'm just like, this is just an obvious gap. Like, how could you make any decisions if you don't understand the value of what you have? And how can you make choices on deals if you're not negotiating from a place of power?
So I agree 100%. And actually, just to your point about bankers, so my former family business, Thomas Publishing, had the brand called ThomasNet. It was the biggest marketplace for buyers and sellers in manufacturing MRO products and services. It was acquired by a strategic in 2021 called Xometry. With that said, in the 5 years running up to it, they started pulling data from the usage of the marketplace, packaging it, and they had like $1 million deals with hedge funds and banks because that data helped them predict market fluctuations.
It helps them with alpha, right? Like they're looking always for alpha. So if your data is of use to something like a Bloomberg or a bank, then I don't know, it's worth thinking about.
Yeah, for sure. So you also broker deals with large and small language models, and your revenue
and traditional buyers and
traditional. Okay, that's excellent. Yeah. So, and you kind of already addressed this, but let me know if I missed anything in terms of like how the market works. I think we talked about what makes data valuable to these companies, but there's also a difference in terms of models where you're selling the data, you get a licensing fee. And then there are models, and I'm just talking about the LLMs and, right now, and SF small language models. But then there's also like a revenue share model. Can,
Yeah.
can you explain the difference between the two?
Yeah, I mean, the first one, when you license something to someone, LLM or not, you're essentially saying you get access to my data for a certain time period against a specific use case. And it gives the company selling a lot of control. It de-risks essentially the transaction. But when you sign a deal where there's revenue share, you're essentially buying a future. You're buying options, right? You're essentially hooking yourself onto the future that this thing is going to make money, and they will be transparent about it and give you essentially your portion of the revenue. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, it's just higher risk.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I don't recommend it because, again, like I said, the market has already been established. Most of the world today buy data not on open marketplaces. Snowflake exists, right? That's a huge marketplace. But the Bank of America is not going to Snowflake to buy data that's going to infuse into their models.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? This is an underground almost market that is essentially, you need to know the brokers, you need to know the data sets you want, and you need to know why you're using it. That's the world we work in. And
Mm-hmm.
so if that's the case, then essentially you're not going to get the quality if you're just putting your stuff onto an open marketplace because the use cases are so finite. But when you are looking for net new buyers, or that example I gave you earlier, like a bank or a capital markets, team that's looking for a specific alpha, they're going after a specific type of data set, and you need to know how to reach them. And that's a much harder exercise than if you were to say, okay, I'm just going to put my data and keep it open, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
we do a lot of work with companies around, do you want to tell the market that you have data services or data products? Do you want to expose that from a risk perspective? That's what when we do go to market in the brokerage piece, we have to have these conversations with CEOs because you have to know what the impact is and the implication. And then if you have certain buyers that may want your data, but there could be reputational risk, what am I doing to mitigate that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This leads me to my next question, and I think the
Oh.
answer is obvious, but when companies attempt data monetization independently, where do they typically fail or put themselves at risk? And how does your approach protect them?
There's definitely a lot of success and then there's a lot of risk, right? Particularly when you are working in markets like California, for example, where there's very strong privacy laws, and in fact, actually, there's half of the states, 20-ish states now have very explicit privacy laws. So I think the most of the US is actually going to eventually become very privacy sensitive, the way Canada and the EU are. And when you know that you have pending legislation coming in, things like that, you have to adapt. You can't actually go to market with what you think is easy and accessible from let's just sell the data, because you don't probably have proper consent. You probably don't have
Mm.
the protocols in the governments to remove the record if someone says, get me out of here. And what happens is you now have a lot of legislation and like litigation happening between individuals and businesses. Again, you could call that mitigatable risk, but this is the example that I'm giving when it comes to, if you don't have proper consent, you don't have proper governance, you don't have proper compliance, that's of the most sensitive level, then to a certain degree, you can't monetize it because the risk is too high. The person who's going to
Mm-hmm.
buy it, the buyer is going to use it, and you put them at risk. Right. And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of that happening, which is not very great for long-term impact. So that's one aspect. I also do see a lot of companies exploring different ways of monetizing, such as retail media platforms, right, which is a way to use the data in an advertising use case. Also great, very effective. But the problem, what I'm finding, is a lot of businesses that are moving into that space, they think they're selling to marketers, but they're not selling to marketers. They're selling to media buyers. And those are very different ICPs. And that's what I'm starting to notice is sometimes you may have a product, it could be giving you already really strong market validation and signals, but you're not selling to the right person. And
Mm-hmm.
so when we work with companies, it's a combination of understanding what are your monetization strategies already, and how do you essentially turbocharge this with consent and explicit opt-in and the ability to opt out at the center of what everything we're doing.
That's a really great response, by the way. Again, things I hadn't even thought of, but
Yeah.
I know, but you're there to help not only identify hard to find, but high value, lucrative opportunities that are, because you understand what those buyers are looking for, but then
Yes.
also the risk, the legal risk that you have with privacy. You just can't be like, hey, here's my data. Like all of those things that a company needs to consider to protect themselves as well as the buyer.
Yeah. And we see a lot of companies today exploring, let's say, marketplaces, right? They're saying, okay, I'm going to put my data here. To be honest, even when you put a custom audience into Facebook, it's a marketplace. But what you don't realize is you're actually leaking the value. The moment you give your data to another entity, it no longer belongs to you. What was the value exchange?
Yep. I like that.
What did you get? It's no different than the publishers relying on programmatic for a decade and slowly getting squeezed, right? You're getting 10 cents on the dollar when before you used to make a dollar. And it's the same exploitation. And so you need to understand that, because we talk about tech debt, but there's also data debt, which is the moment I've given the value away, it's no longer mine. And what did I really get? I got an acquisition, a new customer. Well, a new customer is great if the value of that is higher than the value of my data, but it's not true because you haven't calculated the value of your data.
Well, I was, we had a CEO roundtable and we were talking about some of the early deals that were made, and were they precipitous and not valued correctly because they then sold or licensed their data for this one-time fee. But now that data's out there, as you said, they leaked their value. And how much more data do they have if they've already given the majority of the ship of years and years and years of collected data?
Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And all I can tell you is every single deal you've seen on the market between, let's say, a large language model and a very public entity, whatever that valuation is, it's not the true value. It's 100% under the value.
Yeah, okay. I was like, what is the true? No, it's undervalued.
Under the value. And again, if you think about value, and you talk about this a lot on your podcast, is value is technically subjective. Value is related to what it can generate. So it doesn't matter what price was paid for it. It matters what you're going to use it for and how much money you're going to generate.
Yep. Yeah, I think this whole area, there's so much more work to be done in order for fair value to be at. Yeah. So we're getting to the close, and I wanted to ask you this question just because you're super smart, and I'm going to pick your brain. Looking ahead, how do you see the market for data assets evolving, and what capabilities will companies need to compete effectively? Give us your view for the next 2, 3, 5 years.
So I think we've spent a year spraying money and attempting to get to AI, and that didn't work for anyone. I know for a fact now everybody's rethinking about the framework of how you do it. So we're looking at automation now instead of, complete AGI where something's talking to you something's talking to you autonomously. So I think where companies are going is they're re-looking at the problem. AI is not going anywhere. We just got too excited because we're humans.
Yeah.
And we got too excited. And we need to understand that we need to really understand the technology and the application. And so I think everyone's going to probably spend 2026 testing at a much smaller scale. But when you are testing at a much smaller scale, what you start to see are the gaps. So when your focus goes from very large to very, very minute and very deep, you start to see what are the gaps. And I'll give you an example, right? You'll see businesses start to look for, how do I automate certain parts of my workflow, like customer service or onboarding or whatnot. And when you start to focus on the deeper problems, you will start to see data gaps. Because if, let's say, you're trying to build some sort of agentic component to customer service, but the agent sounds like a robot and has no cultural context, it's not going to know, oh my gosh, there was a strike, this happened, whatnot. So it naturally will sound robotic. And when you have a leader focusing on that, they're going to say, how do I make this thing sound human? And that the only way to solve that is if you go and get a data asset that is relevant enough to essentially train this agentic component to solve for this problem. Right. And so I would say at first I was thinking that it's going to take 10 years. Maybe I'm too like what you were saying earlier. I thought it was going to take 10 years before we see enterprises start taking AI and applying it to their business in a very applied AI form. But I think it's, to your point, going to happen in the next 2 to 5, where we think that the buyers right now for a specific kind of content data is LLMs. In the very near future, in the 2 to 5 year frame, it's going to be enterprise. The moment the enterprises and the private sector start to look at these problems in a very niche and deep way, they will see the gaps. And when they see the gaps, they will need to fill the gaps. Otherwise, how do you compete?
Right, for sure.
And that transformation is going to essentially propel the application of AI, which we'll see the impact of it in the latter half or the latter half of the decade in early 2030s.
Okay. And before I move on to our rapid fire, is there anything I didn't ask that you think would be really valuable to the audience that they should think through as they're going, listening to this podcast?
I think that's a really good point. I think if you haven't thought about data monetization, that's like, oh, that's daunting. That's too much. I would just take a step back and think to yourself and ask yourself, am I collecting my data ethically? I think from a first step, very, very preliminary perspective, do I have ethical opt-in? Do I have consent from my customers? Do I understand how to get that consent? It's very simple, but it's very, very important as you pursue this path. So I would say start there.
That, because that just came to my head. So right now we ask people to opt in. Like, do I have permission to add you to my newsletter? Me as the brand, do I have permission to interact with you? And in some cases, do you want to receive messages from third parties I work with, right? But now this opt-in for permission, if you're thinking of licensing your data or selling your data, that's a whole next level layer of opt-in, no?
Definitely. But why should you be afraid to get opt-in? You're afraid to get opt-in because you're worried that you're not giving enough value to the user for that exchange, if you think about it. Right? If, let's say it's your best friend, they're coming over for dinner, you can ask her anything. Do you want to eat this? Do you want to do this? Do you want to do that? What do you want to do? These are questions you have when there's a lot of trust and value is exchanged. But as a brand, you shouldn't be afraid to ask the user, we're thinking about this. What do you think? We're doing this with your information. Would you like to participate? Like, there's absolutely nothing wrong with asking your customer this, right? But we're so afraid of asking because we think they're going to leave. They're only going to leave if you don't give them enough value.
Right. That's a great point. All right. Well, with that, we're going to flip the switch to something a little fun. I always like to close with a few little rapid fire questions. So, like, what's your favorite way to unplug?
Oh, I love doing yoga and I meditate 3 times a day.
Oh my God. I have to try to do 1 time a day. 3? Okay.
I'm reading this book right now about mind control. We are very new age at Mantis. We even have like a team therapist. So we go to her whenever we need to understand more about like your emotional triggers relative to your brain. And I find it very helpful to meditate several times a day because I'm able to separate the stories I tell myself from how I really feel.
That's really good advice. And my next question, what's the book on your nightstand?
Okay. Yes, it's called Mind Control. Who is it by? I think Mind Control. It's by the Silva Mind Control Method. It's by Jose Silva. Silva. Ooh, and lots of sales on because of Black Friday right now. So.
Okay. And my last question is: AI, savior of media, killer of creativity, or something in between?
Something in between.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
All right, Janice, this has been an incredible conversation. I can't wait to have more of these. For our listeners who want to learn more about Mantis and how to unlock revenue from their data assets or to connect with Janice directly, we'll include Janice's LinkedIn profile and Mantis's website in our show notes. Before we close, a reminder that the conversation doesn't end here. It continues inside Revenue Room CXO, the only network where CEOs and their revenue-critical C-suite teams turn AI disruption into growth strategy. And if you want to experience that thinking live, join us at Rev'd Up 2026, March 23rd through the 24th at the Vinoy in St. Pete, Florida, where the future of data, AI, and revenue leadership takes center stage. We'll share both links in the show notes. And from what I understand, Janice may be joining us there too. So with that, goodbye to everyone. See you next time on the Revenue Room. Janice, thank you. And until next time.